And we are now back to 1861. And so far, Lincoln has won his election. We were early days, and with the Confederacy, if we remember last time, we had 7 states leave, and now we're going to kind of go through and see, I guess, early kind of course of the war, things were happening, strengths and weaknesses, looking at it from both sides, as well as kind of how people viewed the war and thought this was all going to play out within the first year or two. Obviously, with hindsight, we know how it all goes, but it wasn't always as simple as this Northern victory and everything. So, really, neither side kind of thought that war would come. I think the North, for the most part, thought the South was just bluffing, and it was all this talk. Oh, you're going to secede? Okay, no big deal. You're not really going to do that. And people in the South didn't think that the North were actually going to fight for it. They thought that they would just let them go. It'd be easier for them if they became 2 separate countries. That way they wouldn't have to constantly continue to fight about slavery. And they would be fine with what they were, with what they kept to the North of the Union. And those that were in the middle, because it's important to note there are going to be a handful of states that are known as the border states that border the North and the South. Really, they're caught in between the two. They have slavery. They don't want to join the Confederacy. They don't necessarily want to join the Union completely and give up their ability to own slaves. And so really they thought, while they're in the midst of all of this, they really thought the compromise would happen. It happened before in 1820 and 1850. They figured it would happen again. So February of 1861, Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the Confederacy. His vice president is Alexander Stephens from Georgia. Obviously, there is some concern for the Confederacy at this point. There are only 7 states, and for the most part, they are not very well populated. As you can see, there's only about 10% of the United States population is living in the Confederacy at this point. So if they're going to have any chance to succeed with their secession, it's too difficult to say, they need the southern states to join them. And the biggest one is going to be Virginia. The whole Confederacy is going to hinge on whether or not Virginia joins the cause. Because as of this point in February, they have not. So we're going to go, these are notes. We're going to step away. This is actually a quote about what Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, feels about the Confederacy. This is a quote from what he is famously known as his cornerstone speech. And he says, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstones rest upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all truths." And he continues on. But basically, you can see a very obvious and blatant white supremacy speech here. And so if you go through, we are not going to go through this now, but if you wanted to go through and look at the Confederate state constitutions, pretty much all of them were identical to the state constitutions that were originally drafted. The one caveat is it's really going to be the state's right to continue slavery. If you watched the crash course last week like you were supposed to, John's history teacher basically goes through and says, the Civil War is all about states' rights. Well, the states' rights to do what? So if you want to argue that semantically, sure. The Civil War, this is the vice president of the Confederacy who's basically saying that they are going to be the first nation in the world that is going to base their country off of the superiority of white, and that African Americans and blacks are subordinate and an inferior race, and that slavery is their natural condition, normal condition. So it's kind of, again, if he's going to go and say that this is one of the big reasons why the Confederacy is created, it's a rhetorical question that we would have asked and talked about in class, but you don't necessarily really need to argue too much. You wouldn't think if he's going to go and say, it's like one of those kind of murder cases, like the murder, people say, hey, I did it. Gosh, we'll never know who. No, we have an idea as to what this is about. So maybe we shouldn't be arguing about this still. So there are some attempts at compromise early in 1861. There is a thing called the Crittenden Compromise, which is important. You're going to have to. It's one of those kind of things that gets lost in history, just because usually the way it's taught, it's secession by South Carolina. Everybody joins, and then there's war. It's obviously, like all history, it's a lot more complicated than that. But Crittenden Compromise, if you ever write in a paper about early kind of days with the Civil War, I mean, it's an important kind of thing. So the idea was they would extend 3630 to the Pacific. That goes back to that line on southern Missouri. They would create an amendment stating that Congress would not fear with slavery where it already exists. So basically saying that, Lincoln's coming in again. The worry is that he would abolish slavery everywhere, even though he said he wouldn't. And that Congress cannot abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. But at this point, again, the failures of James Buchanan led to a lot of smaller grassroots kind of election wins in the 1858 midterms and then the 1860 elections. So you have a lot of Republicans join Congress in the North, both in the House and the Senate. And so now all of a sudden they're going to control Congress. They're going to reject this proposal, feeling that gives away way too much, that they shouldn't be going through and making constitutional amendments to allow slavery to exist in certain places. There are a lot of people, Republicans still, that realize that, if you extend to 3630, that means that the new territories from the Mexican secession are all liable to have slavery. California is going to be in flux again, and that's not fair to go through and do that. So Republicans reject this. Lincoln, when he is inaugurated, passionately goes through and says in his address that he wants there to be some kind of compromise. He realizes that you can see he's conciliatory yet firm with the South. He wants to make it work, but he's not going to be pushed over. He's not just going to roll over and say, "Okay, do with it what you will, and we'll abide by this." But he does say, again, he's not going to interfere with slavery where it exists in the South. But he does make kind of a bold stand and say secession is illegal, and if you're going to secede from the Union, he's going to view that as treason, and we all kind of know what happens soon. So war is going to break out. Let me move my cool Abraham Lincoln. He looks a lot better when he magically appears later on. So let's get to war actually breaking out. So the Confederacy is going to take over pretty much every military fort in the South, with the exception of two. Most of these forts are unmanned when they're taken over, and no loss of blood. It's more kind of, if you think of a few years ago, there were those militiamen in Oregon who took over a fort in Oregon, and they had that standoff. And thankfully, I think the one or two went to jail for doing that. That's kind of what it was like. I mean, it's more for show than it is a real act of aggression. One of the main ones those two that is left is Fort Sumter, right in the middle of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. And again, it's going to be a big kind of concern. It's right in the heart of the Confederacy. South Carolina, as we know, is such a huge part and leader and drive within the Confederacy. But it's a very strategic place for the Union. They don't necessarily want to go and give this up. Plus, they have roughly 100 men stationed there that they don't want to be captured and all that. So they go back and forth. Lincoln has to decide whether or not he's going to abandon or evacuate the fort as they're running low on supplies. But there are a lot of people in the North that say, if you give this up, this just shows that we're going to push over and we're going to allow the South to do whatever we want. So eventually opinion in the North drives him to provide provisions for the fort, let the fort stay in Northern hands as they go forward. Now, as all this is going on, Lincoln's own Secretary of State, William Seward, is going through and kind of working back channels, basically going and saying to the Confederates that, hey, no big deal, we'll abandon this, and you guys can have this. Just be patient. It'll be like the rest. No, you can control the forts in your area. He did this without telling Lincoln, and actually goes through and even suggests as he's going through that Lincoln should, again, we saw this was a long time ago at the beginning of the year. We had that TED Talk with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who did a biographer on Lincoln. She did LBJ also. But one of the things she talked about with Lincoln was he brought in people that were perhaps more experienced than him. Some of his people who not were enemies, but some of the people that he was going up against to bring him into his cabinet and everything. So Seward kind of sees Lincoln's inexperience and naivety, perhaps, at least what he thinks is going to be naivety, with Lincoln not being able to understand what's going on the big stage. Lincoln had never even been a U.S. senator at this point. And so Seward suggests that Lincoln should give him all the power, and that really what they should do is they should go start a war with France or Spain. That will get everybody back together. Nothing creates patriotism like a good old-fashioned war, and that's how we're going to bring the country together. Lincoln declines. Smart. So Lincoln warns the governor that the relief expedition would be coming to Sumter, and basically puts the onus on President Davis of the Confederacy, and says, if you're going to go and be aggressive towards us, and like, we're making this isn't a strike or anything like that. We're just bringing supplies to our base. If you're going to go and attack us, then you have started this. Davis and his cabinet decide to cut off Sumter before supplies arrive. And so April 12th, 1861, Sumter is fired on by the South. The North surrenders the following day. For the most part, this is going to go. Anybody who was not 100% sure where they stood about the idea of going to war with the Confederacy in the North, this puts everybody on that side. And they are now united. Stephen Douglas famously says there can be no neutrals in this war, only patriots or traitors. So again, even Douglas, who was one of his rivals, is on Lincoln's side, looking at how they view the Confederacy here. So it's really not until now, again, even at Fort Sumter, Confederacy is still 7 states. The Upper South and Confederacy really hinges upon Virginia. It's their biggest state, most populous, has the most industrial capital. Really, just Virginia was able to outproduce the 7 original states combined that went through. Eventually, Virginia will secede, and they are followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, who are all basically waiting, kind of like, well, if Virginia goes, then we'll go, because we realize that this isn't just going to be a complete lost cause. West Virginia, though, will look at this and say, well, Virginia is right now both for West Virginia and Virginia. West Virginia is going to split from the Virginia, wants to remain a border state and part of the Union, and they'll push for statehood. And the other border states that do not leave, even though they have slaves, do not join the Confederacy, will be Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. That's where all those lovely state abbreviations feel like. So this is really the start of the war. This is how it kicks off. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said we talk into kind of strengths and weaknesses of the Confederacy and the Union armies. We will get to that Wednesday with my next notes, which I'm just about to go ahead and do. So that's it for today. You got questions, you guys know what to do. Email me, send me the messages to remind. This is complicated, so please don't just go through this alone. Ask if you need to. Okay. Take care, guys. Miss you.